Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to this webinar from taxonomy design to implementation, evidence, and practical challenges. We're gonna start in a few minutes. We're just gonna give some time for everyone to join. In the meantime, I'll just go ahead and walk us through what today's is gonna look like. I'll tell you a little bit more what's in the agenda for us today. But first of all, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Maria Jimena Jurado. I'm a policy associate at the Center for Cleaner Policy, CCAP. We are an NGO based out of Washington, D.C. We have three program areas: climate finance, carbon markets, and methane mitigation. I'm a policy associate for climate finance and carbon markets, and I'll be your host today. I'm truly delighted to welcome you to this session, which brings together four organizations: CCAP, DIW Berlin, Climate and Company, and Creek, to examine one of the most pressing questions in sustainable finance. How do we move taxonomies from well-designed frameworks and paper to tools that are actually used, understood, and effective on the ground? As we wait for everyone to join, I just want to dive into a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session will run approximately for 90 minutes, closing at 11:30 Eastern Time. Your microphones are muted for now to minimize background noise. We ask you to please keep them that way when our panelists are presenting, to respect their presentations, but we do encourage you to use them during the Q&A session portion of our panel, which will run at the end of the session. Our Q&A moderator, Dr. Catherine Marchewitz, will be tracking those questions that you leave on the chat. When the time comes, you can even open your mic to ask those questions. So we'll have that space. Today's session will be recorded, and the recording, presentation, and all the materials will be shared with all of the registered participants following the event. I will go ahead and talk about the agenda today. Adi, can you confirm how many people? First, I'm not saying the total of assistants, just so I know if we're ready to start.
We are ready. We have 33 attendees, so you can start.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So yeah, today, as I was saying, we'll have a couple of presentations. We'll start with our keynote presentation by Leonard from the UNFCCC, who will be talking about taxonomies for climate mitigation and adaptation. We'll follow with the presentation from CCAP, where we will be presenting our global taxonomy map. We'll then go with DIW with Amanda, who will talk about a research that they've been carrying out and talking about those results, what were the findings. We'll move on with Climate and Company with Daniel, who will be presenting on the actual on-the-ground implementation of these taxonomies. And as I mentioned, we will end with a guided Q&A by Catherine. I will then bring us all together with a wrap-up with some key remarks from the presentation. I would take a moment as people start joining to really highlight who's in the room with us today. Looking at the data that you shared when registering, the largest groups have come from national and subnational governments, consulting services as well, research institutions, and we do have a strongly practitioner-oriented audience. Development finance institutions, NGOs, and the financial sector actors are also represented in those that registered. Geographically, Latin America and the Caribbean is a dominant region. We have nearly 3/4 of the participants, which reflects the CCAP audience as the organizing organization. When we ask about the implementation gaps you have experienced in your own context, you identified 6 recurring themes: data availability and quality, capacity and technical skills, translating frameworks into policy and finance products, terminology inconsistency across jurisdictions, gaps in micro and adaptation finance, and the need for clear cost benefit and incentive frameworks. These are all topics that our presentations are actually going to touch on. So we really hope that if you are one of those people that have identified these as some of the gaps that you've experienced, that you can really see how the presentations have been catered to bring us together around those themes. With that, I will now begin by introducing our keynote address, which is Leonard Schmidt. He's a climate finance program officer at the UNFCCC Secretariat. Leonard will be speaking on the role of sustainable finance taxonomies for climate mitigation and adaptation, situating these instruments within the broader climate finance architecture and their contribution to the Paris Agreement implementation. Leonard, with that, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jimena, and CCAP colleagues and everyone here. It's a pleasure being invited on this panel. Speaking on sustainable finance taxonomies is one of my favorite things to talk about in the climate finance sphere, as this was the initial topic that brought me to sustainable finance way back in 2018. Let me start out with saying that the sustainable finance taxonomy landscape has really picked up over the last years. As you can see on this map, this is drawn from a report that CBI, and happy to see that colleagues are on the call, has produced for the Taxonomy Roadmap Initiative late last year. It's just to illustrate that the classification systems for sustainable economic activities have really expanded worldwide and in all geographic regions. And although this map is from late 2025, it's already outdated. I think the last news I heard was Cambodia has now published their taxonomy, I think even this week or the week prior. So it's really an interesting case of a sustainable finance tool that is being adopted worldwide and tailored to different audiences and country contexts. And it's also from a UNFCCC standpoint and from looking at it through the lens of the Paris Agreement, the bottom-up nature, but also combining or showcasing international cooperation. There has been so many actors involved in supporting countries and developing national or regional frameworks. So many institutional partners and knowledge sharing on sustainable finance tools. If you can go to the next slide, please. It's been, over the past years, clear that taxonomy development really evolved over time. So there was first in the 2010s, first national examples of activity or classification lists. Bangladesh or the China Green Bond Catalog come to mind, and then large regional groupings, the EU, ASEAN started their own taxonomy projects, also working on regulation. And over time, we could also see innovations, whereas taxonomies at the beginning were really focused on one major objective, the climate mitigation objective. Over time, the resilience angle, thinking about transition finance and taxonomies that cater to transitional activities became more of a focus. The so-called traffic light system of green, amber, and red activities. So kind of amber activities meaning transitional activities, and red activities meaning activities that are incompatible with an objective, or that where, for example, phase-out support could be involved, became a concept. And recently we've also seen advances on social elements being integrated more strongly in taxonomies. For example, in the LAC region, Brazil has set a strong focus on this. There was taxonomies that had a specific focus, for example, on the agriculture sector and land use sector. Colombia comes to mind, but also the New Zealand taxonomy that is really focused on their national priority, which is the agriculture and land use sector as well. And for example, there were differentiated activities depending on the level of advanced technologies that could be used, and this speaking to really the social aspects and social dimensions of a transition towards kind of more advanced green activities. And interoperability of all these frameworks has featured from the start in discussions of taxonomies, but is now becoming more and more a focus area as more countries develop those frameworks, and it becomes clear that especially for internationally operating financial institutions, corporations, but also for broader regulation and cross-border financing, a certain extent of interoperability is very useful and needed to kind of scale up the flows that are also one of the key intents of taxonomies. So many countries state explicitly that one of the aims of their taxonomies, and I will come to that in the next slide, is scaling up climate finance. But maybe also to really focus on that point, taxonomies remain anchored in national and regional realities and policy contexts. And this table at the bottom here is just an example of that, of multiple dimensions where the Standing Committee on Finance in their biannual assessment and overview of climate finance flows in the latest edition, which was published, looked into some of the design features of taxonomies. This is outdated, so it's 2 years old. There will be a new report being published, the 7th BA, later this year, prior to COP. And just to mention one point or 2 points here, the national context is really key, and basically all countries, apart from a taxonomy from CBI, which naturally doesn't consider to that extent the national context, explicitly stated that their taxonomy is anchored in their national realities. And of course, many countries and reference in their taxonomies explicit alignment with the Paris Agreement, being science-based or in line with the 1.5 mitigation target. More and more, we also see that adaptation and resilience is becoming a focus. So many of those taxonomies started out with mitigation and are now looking into the next development stage, including more resilience and disaster risk management activities in their taxonomies. To close off with this short primer, next slide, please, is the implications of taxonomies for understanding climate finance flows at domestic and global level. First of all, it's been a very useful methodological tools for countries to enhance their financial capacities when it comes to climate. So that's building the capacities in the ministries of finance and in the line ministries, so ministries other than the environment ministries who know about climate anyways. It's been useful to promote financial sector development and really foster awareness on climate among the main users. It could be very useful as well for public monitoring, reporting, and verification and tracking system. Sometimes it can be used or the methodologies can be used, for example, to inform national climate budget tagging, green bond issuances, etc. So there's a lot of synergies that can be that can be utilized from initial taxonomy projects. It's also very useful to enlighten everyone and also the regulators and policymakers on the status of private sector finance and what's really happening in the real economy. Often that's a gap in assessments at the national level, but also at the global level. So especially on the adaptation and resilience side, there's huge data gaps and little knowledge of what corporations are already doing on resilience, for example, through their balance sheets, through their operational expenditures to keep infrastructure up to date, for example. So there's the assumption that a lot of spending is already happening, but it's not visible. And one of the key aims often is capital mobilization of through taxonomies towards the national and international climate goals. Most countries specify their NDCs, NAPs, LTLEDs. It can be a useful tool to inform and finance country plans and also to inform private sector investment and transition planning for the future. Lastly, a point on how taxonomies can also support the global understanding of and the transparency on climate finance, including the regional, national, and sector-specific nuances. It's a very interesting case where taxonomies, because they are so broad-based but also varied, they can provide an understanding how different regions, how different sectors think about the transition. And the taxonomy projects provide a very valuable database and information on what can be expected of certain sectors, what could be financed to support the transition. It is to note, though, that in the UNFCCC space, in the Paris Agreement, the transparency arrangements, there at the moment there's no dedicated tracking of domestic finance, for example, and the ETF, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, the provisions or what is reported there relates to under Article 9 to financial support provided and mobilized, as well as to financial support needed and received. Some countries in their BTR, so that's the kind of framework communication, on a voluntary basis communicate, for example, on their domestic public finance expenditures. So there's voluntary ways to report, for example, on outcomes from tracking of taxonomy flows, but there is no obligation also to do so under the Paris Agreement. And with that, I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much, Leonard. This really gives us a great baseline landscape of where we are, what are the trends we're seeing worldwide, as well as the different considerations that countries are being faced with when thinking of creating and implementing their own national taxonomies. We will have a chance, as you said, to return to several of these themes we're seeing coming up with the taxonomies during our Q&A. For now, I'll move on to our next presentation. Our next presenter is my colleague here at CCAP, Adriana Bazán-Fuster. She's a Climate Finance Program Manager. Adriana will present CCAP's Global Taxonomy Map and Dashboard, a first of its kind open access platform that consolidates verifiable, comparable data on taxonomy development and implementation across every jurisdiction that has one worldwide. Adriana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jimena. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you to the more than 60 people attending to this webinar. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you. And well, I would like to walk you a little bit through the global taxonomy and dashboard that the Center for Clean Air Policy has built for the past months. And this tool, it actually builds on so many years of research on sustainable finance taxonomies, over 4 years of research, but also work that we have done on taxonomies in different countries, and also building on the work that CCAP has done with the Latin America and the Caribbean Observatory of Sustainable Finance Taxonomies, along with other NGOs through the Latin America and the Caribbean region. You can either scan here with your phone, your tablet, the Global Taxonomy Map and Dashboard, and also Jimena has shared here with you the link. Next slide, please. This Global Taxonomy Map and Dashboard can give us a very quick picture of how the landscape of taxonomies is looking like on real time. We are actually updating this dashboard on a monthly basis, but in case you have any news, we can very quickly just update this, and on real time, you can get to see this information. You can get to see this map with the different colors. I will go and walk you through that. Next slide, please. In this Global Taxonomy Map and Dashboard, we have mapped over 76 jurisdictions that are either working on a taxonomy, have either published a taxonomy, or they're planning to develop a taxonomy. As Maria Jimena said, this is a first of a kind open access platform because you can get to see the information on real time, but you can also download the data. You can either replicate this map, and you can either use this map on your website or whatever purposes you require. You can actually also download the image. This is a transparency tool because it supports comparability, the cross-cutting learning, and evidence-based decision-making. You can either get to see all taxonomies that are mapped in this dashboard. And we have comprehensive data in a sense that it actually gives you in which development stage the taxonomy is, what is the governance mechanism, what is the institution that is in charge of creating this taxonomy, or it's in charge of its implementation, what is the sectoral coverage, and what are the different environmental objectives as well. And for some implementation insights, we also are trying to map what are the kind of tools that these taxonomies are accompanied with. Other taxonomy tools for socialization, for usage, or for implementation. Next slide, please. You can get to see different key features in here. We have created index cards for the taxonomies that are developed. You can get to see the different variables that we have put in there, the year of publication, the institution who's in charge of the governance or the implementation, what is the sectoral coverage, what are the environmental objectives that are covered, if there is a private sector taxonomy in place, because let's just remember that this dashboard, it's only about taxonomies that have been published by the country government. And also we have information about the link directly to either an official website or a website that it contains all the information about this taxonomy. So you can get access to all this information in here. We have also created this map in Spanish. We have it under the website of the Observatory of Sustainable Finance Taxonomies in Latin America and the Caribbean, but we have also on the CCAP website. And it's completely in Spanish, and you can download the information, and the index cards are in Spanish for those who are interested in more the Latin America and the Caribbean taxonomy country context. Next slide, please. In here, I'm going to show you a demo, and please, Jimena, if you can click on the video. It's very easy to access. We have it under CCAP's website. You can go and get to see different countries. You can either put your mouse in one of the countries and you get information more about the status of the taxonomy, the year of publication, the responsible organization, the language as well. A click to either a website or the index card where we have created these index card with more information synthesized that you can get to see more about the taxonomy. As I mentioned, environmental objectives, sectoral coverage, and you can get to see here in real time how the map is looking like. Once again, we update this every month. And also, if you have any information or if you would like to shoot us an email and saying, hey, I think this taxonomy needs to be changed in terms of a status, or I have more information about the taxonomy, feel free to do it. For us, this is an open data source that really what we want is everyone to have open data access. Next slide, please. Once again, you can scan here the map, the dashboard, or you can go through our website. Jimena, can I share my screen? I would like to do a quick demo. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will start sharing my screen. Just give me a few seconds. And Jimena, I don't know if you can confirm that you are seeing my screen right now. Thank you. Thank you so much. So if you go and click on the link that Jimena shared, you can get to see here CCAP's website where we have hosted the Global Taxonomy Map and Dashboard. You can get to see the map in English, worldwide, and you can see the map in Spanish as well, which is only for Latin America and the Caribbean region. I'm going to show you very quickly how it works. We have the status of the national taxonomy. It's either developed and implemented, and you can get to see here the color, the ones that are under development, which means that the country government is either working on a draft or they are already working in the working groups. They're drafting something. Plan to develop, it's because there are some news, there's an idea, there's a roadmap to work on the taxonomies. We have put abandoned here. It's just one case, is the UK taxonomy, and then no taxonomy. And also you can get to see if these taxonomies are either part of a regional taxonomy framework, as the African Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, the ASEAN, the CARICOM, which they're actually working on a green taxonomy framework, the Central America taxonomy, and of course, the European Union. As I shared with you, you can get to see here the status of the different taxonomies. I'm going to walk you very quickly to one of the taxonomies that I really like, and there's a lot of information. This is the taxonomy of Thailand, which is developed and implemented. There are 2 years of publication. You can get to see here 2023 and 2025. Responsible organization is the Bank of Thailand, and the language is English. For all taxonomies that are developed, once again, developed, we have created the index cards for your quick reference. You can get to see more information. If it's part of a regional taxonomy, what is the eligibility approach? In this case, is technical screening criteria, and the granularity for metrics and thresholds, which they use a traffic light system. And if it's voluntary or mandatory, and if there's a private sector taxonomy in the country, environmental objectives, economic sectors, and if there are any tools, or if include social components or not. You can either click here under the index card, or on the same here, information on more information, you can visit the site that it's linked to the official website. And here you can get to see the Bank of Thailand's website with more information about the taxonomy, a summary. I really like this website because it contains a lot of information and a lot of tools for the understanding of taxonomies. Videos in here, and when you click on learn more on knowledge sharing, you can get to see more information about the different webinars, guidance for users, infographics. I'm going to use Google Translate for English. More information about guidance for users, infographics, etc. The e-learning documents as well, and everything that has been published by the government. This is just one example, but there are other examples, such as in the case of Ghana, where you can get to see the information, you can visit the site, you can download the taxonomy. We have linked these websites so you can get to see the latest documents in here, or you can go to either Côte d'Ivoire. You can go and get to see the information, visit the site. So for us, it's very compelling and actually has taken a lot of our time to put together this for the whole community. And I really, really hope you can find it useful. What can you do with the data, right? Here you can actually download the image. So if you want just to use this image for presentations, or you want just to use it for your reports, you can either use it. You can also embed this map into your website in case you're interested in using it. And you can also get the data, right? You will get a .csv document, a raw document. This is not the one. I'm going to show you the one. This is the raw data that actually feeds up the whole map. But with some assistance and with some work, you can actually work in a very compelling Excel document. You can now put filters on, and you can get to see all the information that feeds up this dashboard and this map, and is 100% available to all of you. This is open data access. You have access to all of this. You can either replicate this map at the regional level, you can translate it into your own language. You can actually just focus in one region specifically. And you can get to see more information here about the eligibility approach and things that we didn't include, such as more information about the responsible organization, the classification of economic activities, right? And all the websites that we have linked these taxonomies with. I'm going to stop sharing, Jimena. I don't know if you can help me with the rest of my presentation.
Of course. Thank you so much for the demo, Ade. And here you go. The mic is yours again.
Thank you so much. And as you can get to see, taxonomies have a scale globally. The majority of the map is color-coded. We have 46 developed and implemented taxonomies that have already been published by a jurisdiction, 22 under development, which means that they are working under working groups. They're actually putting together a roadmap. They are in communications with certain stakeholders, and 8 taxonomies that we have mapped that are planning to develop. It's either an announcement or a news that we have found. We have seen that around 75% of these taxonomies that we have mapped use technical screening criteria closely mirroring the EU taxonomy approach. 60% of them rely on ISIC or an equivalent international classification system. Around 80% use a binary approach, green or not green, and with only a small group, mainly in ASEAN, are using a traffic light system or a transition framework. Roughly 40% of them are connected to a regional taxonomy, and we're seeing more interoperability advancing on a regional scale. And over 80% of taxonomies converge around a common set of environmental objectives, and those are mitigation, adaptation, water, biodiversity, circular economy, and pollution. And what we have seen here, after 4 years of research, is that taxonomy design is no longer the challenge. Like, we are seeing that all these taxonomies are following kind of like a common pattern, and that they have already passed that momentum that we saw, that boom of taxonomies that we saw back in 2022 and 2023. And countries are converging around similar frameworks and methodologies. Next slide, please. What we're seeing right now is a taxonomy implementation gap, and this is one of the reasons we are creating and putting together this webinar, because the majority of these taxonomies remain voluntary, with a very handful of taxonomies introducing some mandatory elements. Only about 40% of the taxonomies that we have mapped include dedicated tools for socialization, for usage, or for implementations, such as guidelines, dashboards, trainings, Excel-based tools. And only 50% of the taxonomies include social or just transition components, indicating that the most frameworks are environmentally focused and not fully aligned with broader SDGs agendas. So our key takeaway in here is that for taxonomies to shift capital at scale, they need to be moving beyond standalone frameworks and become more embedded into policy and regulatory instruments, such as example, as Leonard was saying, is like integrating this into more climate finance transparency frameworks. That is all, Jimena. So I give the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eliana. This dashboard is such a powerful resource, and what you've shown us about the implementation landscape really sets up for our next presenter perfectly. I am pleased to hand it over to our colleagues at DIW Berlin. Fernanda Sofia Ballesteros is a research associate at DIW Berlin's Climate Policy Department, where she works at the intersection of industrial decarbonization and sustainable finance. Fernanda will present findings from DIW Berlin's comparative research study, Sustainable Finance Taxonomies, designed to enable the transition to net zero, which analyzed 44 taxonomies globally to assess how well existing frameworks are designed to support economy-wide transitions, with particular attention to emerging and developing economies. Fernanda, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and the words before. Super interesting. Yeah, I'm really happy to present today research we have done here at DIW. This is joint work with my colleagues Catherine Marchewitz, Franziska Schütze, and Nasreen Hajab-Arab. And this is actually precisely what we asked. I think Jimena already introduced it quite well. So we asked, are those taxonomies out there actually fit for purpose, or are they designed to enable the transition towards net zero? And there we have a specific angle. We look not only at whether those taxonomies are able to finance already green activities, but we also want to understand to what extent they also incorporate transitional activities. And I'm starting with a map. I think we have seen maps, enough maps today, so I will keep it short. But I think just to make the point again, the global spread is enormous, but the question really is how do the approaches differ, and where do we see convergence, and how do those approaches can actually also maybe be used for transition finance. Next slide, please. So what have we actually done? So we looked at 44 taxonomies across 5 criteria, and in total we identified 89 taxonomies, and this is based on the last update we've done in September 2025. So I know that since then other frameworks have emerged, and some frameworks have been updated, but this research is based on what we had available back in September 2025. So what are the criteria we look at? So we have first the criterion of policy embeddedness, where we look at whether the framework actually defines policy objectives of the framework, and whether those objectives are linked then to other international or national commitments like the Paris Agreement, NDCs, or other national strategies. Then we look at the sectoral coverage, so what sectors are actually included in the taxonomy, and what does that mean in terms of GHG emissions for the country. Then we look at the screening approach, so we evaluate the approach to how the framework is defining eligible economic activities. Then we look at the target group, so we want to understand what actors are actually expected, or for which actors is it actually made obligatory to use the framework, and which instruments are covered. Some frameworks, for example, are only covered for green bonds. And then finally, the 5th criterion looks at disclosure and reporting, where we want to understand whether they are on top of, for example, a framework being mandatory, whether there are a disclosure and reporting requirements, so that, for example, a bank has to report their taxonomy aligned share of activities that are aligned with the taxonomy framework. Next slide, please. These are our results at a glance. Don't look at the countries. I would recommend, it's a bit confusing with that high number, but I think the pattern is quite interesting here to see. So we evaluated based on a score from no contribution to significant contribution. And what we can see is that as for the first criterion, I introduced the policy embeddedness, most frameworks perform relatively well. So all of them define clear objectives and link them appropriately to national and international commitments. and also sometimes also extend to broader sustainability goals like circular economy and resource efficiency, biodiversity, but also social goods. Then in terms of sector coverage, the picture is quite mixed. So a lot of taxonomies cover more than 90% of the emissions, but some of the taxonomies also focus on specific sectors only. This is partly also because some taxonomies we elevated are only draft versions, which have then only in the first versions specific sectors included. So these results are also should be taken with caution here. And then when it comes to the screening approach, the criteria we defined are less fulfilled. I will get to that later a bit. So what we looked at is, do they define technical screening criteria, but then also how do they measure it, and how transparent are they about the origin of where this specific threshold for an activity originates. And then for the target group, it is often a voluntary framework and expected to be applied by a broad set of sectors, but no specific obligations arise from that. And then related to the point, since it is mostly voluntary, there are also no reporting or disclosure requirements linked to it. Interestingly, most of the frameworks do write about reporting and disclosure requirements, but cannot enforce it because it's only a voluntary framework. But they acknowledge at least the importance. Next slide, please. Right, so now we do a little deep dive on the criterion of policy embeddedness. So as I said earlier, so here most countries perform quite well. What does that mean? So a lot of taxonomies actually define the environmental goals of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and then link it properly to like a 1.5 degree commitment as defined in the Paris Agreement, but also to national determinant contributions, and then also say, okay, this is not only basically our commitment as part of the Paris Agreement, but we also link this to national decarbonization strategies and national climate targets. And a lot of frameworks actually also go even beyond this and look at broader sustainability goals, where they also include targets like circular economy, resource efficiency, biodiversity, and also social goals. In most of the frameworks, this is done via minimum social safeguards. For example, the quality here differs, but most of them refer to it at least. Next slide, please. Then when it comes to the share of covered emissions across frameworks, as I mentioned earlier, the share varies considerably. So we have a few frameworks that include all sectors, like for example, the Asian taxonomy, the Ugandan taxonomy, the Nepalese taxonomy, the taxonomy from Pakistan, etc. We also have some special cases like the Philippines, because the Philippines, they have a sector agnostic framework because it's principle based, so it technically applies to all the sectors. So here we say it indirectly covers all sectors. And then we also have some cases where there are only few sectors covered. But again, these results should be taken with caution. And I also want to mention that the sector mapping we did is rather on a very aggregate level. So because we use data from the World Emissions Clock, where the sectors are on a higher level, so we can't really look into specific product groups, which might be useful if one wants to look at one specific taxonomy. But for the aggregate glimpse on the development of such frameworks, we thought might be sufficient. And I think the overall pattern is still valid here. Next slide, please. Then when it comes to the screening approach, which is sort of the core of the criteria we looked at to understand also how transition activities can be supported within such frameworks, we identified various approaches. So most of the frameworks define technical screening criteria, and this can also mean that they just define, for example, a list of activities to be included or qualitative criteria, but often the origin of these criteria is not quite clear. So is that linked to a specific science-based pathway, or is it linked to specific national law? And we see room for improvement here. And also, for example, if it's a whitelist approach and if activities are listed, then the question is also, are all I don't know, for example, activities within the steel sector allowed, or does it have to be linked to specific quantitative thresholds, which is then the second category, where we identify frameworks that define clear technical screening criteria and then also link it to measurable thresholds. So I think the most prominent example of a measurable threshold is an emission intensity benchmark. So to say that an activity can only be aligned with a taxonomy or considered as green or sustainable if it's below a certain emission intensity threshold. And then in the next step, we also wanted to understand, okay, if they do that, where does it originate from, and do they plan to update the thresholds regularly? Because then the question is also, for example, in the EU taxonomy, we kind of have already a transition category included. We have, for example, the steel and cement sector covered based on the emission intensity benchmarks from the UTS benchmarking, which are, however, as of now, only the snapshot for the conventional technology, the best conventional technology. And the question is then, if at some point green technologies will be more available in the market of steel and cement, how does this threshold adapt to this, and how will those thresholds be updated? So taxonomies in the right part of the graphs that have a high contribution do have dynamic thresholds and basically account for the fact that they have to evolve over time. And if they don't have dynamic thresholds, then they also look at, for example, at or they are based on a system such as the traffic light system. So they say, okay, we have the clear green criteria, and then for the amber categories, we have specific thresholds that will be adapted over time, or activities that are not green as of now have to demonstrate based on a transition plan that they will be green in the future. Next slide, please. And this leads me precisely to my last slide on this point. So the question of how are transitional activities actually addressed within those frameworks. And I wanted to highlight maybe two frameworks that we found to be interesting in this context, the Singapore taxonomy and the Asian taxonomy, which both rely on a more dynamic approach to include broader economic activities and not only to focus on green activities, but also to include activities that can be decarbonized, but maybe as of now are not to be classified as green because the market is not ready yet. So what Singapore, for example, does, it uses the traffic light system, and then for the amber categories, there are sunset dates, and the activity has to demonstrate how it, or the firm has to demonstrate how it will reach this target, for example, via a transition plan or via CAPEX investments that are then to be evaluated by the financial actor. And for the coal phase out, there's also for both frameworks, actually for the Singaporean and for the Asian frameworks, coal phase out guidelines. So for example, the Singaporean taxonomy also defines that there then has to be just transition plan in place. And for the Asian activity, for the Asian framework, we can observe something similar in the plus standard. Transition activities that are not green or sustainable as of now have to demonstrate a meaningful pathway to alignment. They don't mention explicitly, at least in version 3, the word transition plan, but it goes into a similar direction. And they even have this technical screening review body, which I think is a really interesting case, where they decide on regular updates about the technical screening criteria or the measurable quantitative thresholds, which then has also this institutionalized element of tracking where do we stand in terms of technology development, where do we need to make updates. And these two examples are hopefully an interesting example for how this can be done. And with this, I would like to conclude my presentation and hopefully have some more discussions on those approaches later in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fernanda. The divergences you've highlighted across jurisdictions, in policy embeddedness, in sectoral coverage, the screening approaches really illuminate how complex it is to build frameworks that are both rigorous and actionable. We will now, with this, I think a great segue is to turn to our colleagues at Climate and Company, who bring that complementary and very grounded vantage point, the perspective of practitioners on and end users. So our final presentation comes from Daniel Schatwitz. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your last name. He's a sustainable finance and taxonomy expert at Climate and Company, a German sustainable finance think tank. Daniel advises national governments and financial institutions across Latin America, Africa, and Asia on green finance taxonomy development and implementation. He will share first lessons learned from the financial sector, grounding our earlier analytical discussions in the practical realities facing those who work with taxonomies day to day. Daniel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jimena, and good afternoon, good morning, buenos dias a todos. Really, it's a pleasure to be here and talk about taxonomies with such like-minded people and everybody who's been doing so much research in it. So maybe just a couple of more words on Climate and Company. We've basically been involved in the taxonomy work since 6 years, been involved in the European taxonomy development, but also globally in different taxonomies in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Currently, we're working in the Maldives, for example, on taxonomy implementation, but also with the Central Bank of Madagascar on the taxonomy development. So it's really great to see right now everything theoretically about taxonomies and what is actually happening on the ground. What kind of challenges there are, but also what kind of lessons learned there are. And we exactly want to focus now on the financial sector when it comes to taxonomy implementation. So talking about the implementation of taxonomy, we're of course talking about taxonomy use cases, and in this case for financial institutions, what kind of possibilities there are to use to implement taxonomies. And I only want to highlight here the low complexity use cases. There's a much bigger list of other taxonomy use cases which are more complex, more difficult, but considering that the taxonomies have only been around in most jurisdictions for a couple of years, we want to rather focus here on the low complexity one, on the most common taxonomy use cases. So first of all, of course, sustainable debt labels are very often used when it comes to taxonomy. So the issuance of green bonds, sustainability bonds in alignment with the taxonomies. And another very important, most common use case is corporate climate disclosure. So really that corporates, financial institutions, they disclose their taxonomy aligned revenue, CapEx, OpEx, basically in line with taxonomy. And another point that is coming more and more, if we could, exactly, thank you, Jimena. At one point, actually, that also is more and more coming up right now is product origination. So developing green loans and that are aligned with the taxonomy. But this is something still that we're seeing slowly coming up right now for financial institutions, for banks, that there's also much more demand for these kind of green loans. Next slide, please. So as an example, actually, what kind of impact taxonomies had when it comes to some of the use cases. Here's one example from China in regard to green social and sustainability bond issuance. So we can see the green bond endorsed project catalog in China, which is the China taxonomy in that sense, was first released in 2015, and afterwards there basically the issuance of sustainability bonds went up. But with the release of the version 2 in 2020, we can really see that that had a big impact and catalyzed the issuance of green, social, and sustainability bonds in China. Next slide. Yes, in the European Union, we also have the use case, for example, of taxonomy-aligned green asset ratios that banks, financial market participants have to disclose. And here we have the case, so we're talking about taxonomy aligned green asset ratio, meaning that basically these assets fully comply with the criteria that are outlined in the European taxonomy. And this was in 2024, 2.8%, so quite low in that sense. But considering that reporting only started for a couple of years, there is like now this trend that this number is growing, of course. And what we especially see is that more and more taxonomy eligible assets are actually also being identified. So taxonomy eligible basically means in this case that those assets, those projects fall within the taxonomy, the European taxonomy. They are basically can be identified in the taxonomy, which does not mean they are eligible. So they do not yet necessarily clarify with the criteria that are laid out in the taxonomy. And the same we see for taxonomy aligned green investment ratio, which is at the moment at 3%, but also we see that there's an increasing number of taxonomy eligible activities as well. So this is like, of course, it's a slow process, but it's definitely growing. There's a lot more awareness among the banks in the European Union as well on the taxonomy, and much more is done. So it's definitely also a very good signal as well. But what kind of challenges are there actually for financial institutions? And a lot of these, so some of these challenges that we have selected here are basically also informed by our work that we do internationally in developing countries. So I wanted to highlight a couple of them here, which I think have been also already thrown around a little bit in different webinars. So one of the most important points actually when it comes to implementation challenges is the data availability and quality. So there's a lack of corporate clients' data, so especially at a granular level. For now, a lot of companies, they can already disclose data on their greenhouse gas emissions, on their footprint. But when it comes to biodiversity topics, water-related topics, it's just very, very difficult to get this data. Difficult for the banks to receive that data, but of course also difficult for the corporate clients to produce that kind of data. Methodologies, for example, are very inconsistent in that regard. There's a lack of standardized data. It's very often very costly also for those corporate clients to produce that kind of data, which then in hindsight also affects the financial institutions in receiving that data, analyzing that data, and informing their own decisions. And on top of that, there's very limited verification capacity as well within financial institutions to actually make sure that they can verify this data. On top of that, we have operational complexity. So often it's difficult for financial institutions to actually integrate the taxonomy into their internal banking system. So looking at lending systems, risk models, portfolio reporting, because of course the taxonomy classifies certain activities or sectors according to their own classification system, but sometimes in the banking system it works a little bit different. So a lot of the internal systems have to change. It takes quite a lot of time. It takes a lot of costs, a lot of training to make this basically operational. And this is something that has to be taken into consideration and looked at much more when already developing taxonomy, so that this taxonomy actually works with the banking systems as well. And then there's very often the idea that we have a taxonomy established right now. There should be plenty of green projects, green assets right now, but the reality is actually that there is a lack of those green assets and bankable projects, and these taxonomies do not create them themselves, but rather it needs to be hand in hand with other projects, with other public investments, transition planning, in order to get these bankable projects, this pipeline of investments ready, so that also capital can be allocated into them. So that's a very important point. And then the last 3 points here, like I want to focus on the first one, which is like weak institutional coordination. So we can actually look from two sides on this. The first side would be institutional coordination from the more regulatory side, that there is a lot of overlap very often in initiatives, unclear responsibilities, limited alignment between central banks, Ministry of Finance, other regulators that are out there, and very often parallel reporting systems that those banks have to report to. So we have heard from some of the banks that we work with, well, we are already reporting according to what the central bank is telling us, but we also have to report for other regulatory authorities, and there is a very big burden on us that we have to now comply with another framework, and there's no real coordination and coherence behind those. And this is one of the main pain points for FIs. Why is this so difficult? And then on top, we also have the other side, that there's actually from the financial institutions, there needs to be institutional governance, like it needs to be anchored in the bank as well, so that you have somebody who actually takes care of the taxonomy implementation. And that is also still very often missing. There might be a sustainability department, somebody who's working on this, but it really needs to be grounded and also needs to be part of the executive management, basically, that those sustainability decisions are being pushed forward. Then as the next point, I want to highlight here the regulatory fragmentation. So this is something where we're now in a globalized world, of course. Banks do not only work in their own country settings anymore, but also go to other countries, have operations in other countries. And here we get to the point of fragmentation, that basically if foreign banks like work in another context, they of course have to report according to the home country taxonomy, but they also have to report according to the taxonomy in which they're operating, which then leads to this kind of issue that different jurisdictions have different meanings of green, and there needs to be basically more interoperability for this. There needs to be this better understanding when we're talking about certain green things, that we mean the same thing. And when it comes to like renewable energies and criteria, or the energy sector in general, it's a little bit easier because we're talking about greenhouse gas emission. But when it comes to more difficult, more tricky sectors, activities, especially in biodiversity, it gets very, very messy. And it's important here to look at this kind of interoperability of those frameworks in order to also reduce the compliance work for financial institutions, and just support them that they can actually implement the taxonomies. And lastly, one point which of course is very like always mentioned when it comes to like new frameworks that are being implemented, the internal capacity constraints. So as I mentioned before, there's a lack of taxonomy specialists or ESG data teams, especially within financial institutions in markets which are not that mature yet. So this is one important point that needs to be looked at. And I want to highlight here especially the taxonomy pilot programs, peer learning, and regulator industry dialogues, which are very, very important to actually make sure that capacities are already built and that taxonomies which are developed take in or integrate all of the feedback from the banks, which are supposed to, in the end, use also these frameworks. So taxonomy pilots, in our opinion, are most important already in the development stage of taxonomies. So some lessons learned from our work for taxonomy implementation, and we've already heard this before during the other discussions and presentations. Taxonomies should not be a standalone product, not be a standalone framework that just sits somewhere on a desk, but rather it should work really with the whole wider financial system. With different ESG frameworks that are out there, it really needs to be embedded into the wider financial system. And another lesson learned is actually that operationalization matters more than just taxonomy design. What we mean by this is when designing the taxonomy, it should not only be the goal to have a taxonomy, but rather to implement it, to have impact with that. And that the goal is already when designing the taxonomy, you, for example, have certain pilot initiatives in order to test the taxonomy with the end users, so that you can integrate all of the learnings from that pilot phase into the taxonomy design in order to really create robust frameworks that work within the local context and the systems that are in place already. Then the third point here is taxonomy effectiveness depends heavily on underlying data ecosystems. So I think this point has been now mentioned a couple of times. So data is very important, and we need to make sure that we have reliable data. And the next point would be voluntary systems create awareness, but mandatory systems create scale. What we mean by this is that voluntary implementation of the taxonomy in the beginning phase is of course good. It should not overburden the users, but only through mandatory usage of the taxonomy you will actually create impact and change, because then in the end it's really a whole market adoption and everybody is part of it, and not only a few champions, bigger banks that can actually allow and have the resources to implement the taxonomy. So we think it should always go from a voluntary, easy adoption into a mandatory one to make sure that the whole ecosystem is part of it. And my last point here would be that global harmonization may be unrealistic at this point. We've seen there are so many different frameworks out there already. Everybody has their own taxonomy, but that should not scare us, but rather we should look at the taxonomy interoperability, which is still achievable through different initiatives that are out there. And of course, very often in the taxonomy design, this kind of interoperability is already at the center of the taxonomy framework in the end. So these are some of the takeaways that we feel from Climate On Company are very important for taxonomy implementation. Thank you so much. And I'm handing back over to Jimena. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for this presentation. Those implementation realities are exactly the kind of ground level evidence we need to bridge the gap between design and impact, as you were mentioning. And this last part brings us to our last segment of the day, the Q&A. We now have around 15 minutes or so of our guided Q&A by Dr. Catherine Markowitz. Catherine is the Managing Director at Governance and Values Stewardship Professionals and a member of Creek Tank. Her research sits precisely at the intersection of sustainable finance, investor stewardship, and transition governance, which makes her exceptionally well placed to draw the threads across today's presentations. So Catherine, we're in your hands.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a few words just on Crick. As you mentioned, the Corporate Responsibility Interface Center is a Germany-based nonprofit organization which is focused on promoting sustainable finance and responsible investments. And yeah, I'm a member of the think tank of this organization, serving as a platform for scientific reflection and especially on interdisciplinary research on sustainable finance. So thank you all the speakers so far for your insightful contributions. We've heard a range of perspectives today already, from global evolution of taxonomies, analytical assessments of their alignment with net zero objectives, to the practical realities of implementation on the ground. Let's bring it together. I have seen some questions in the chat and I will pick them up in a few minutes, but I would just like to open the discussion to all panelists on the core challenges of moving from design to implementation, which is in our headline of today's webinar. So you have all addressed already some points on the challenges of implementation, but maybe you could just briefly point a few out. So what do you see as the key bottlenecks preventing taxonomies from becoming fully decision useful tools? Who would like to start? Diana, would you like to kick off?
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for that question. I think I will retake what Daniel just mentioned right at the end, right? The taxonomy design and development is not the end goal. It's just the beginning of a whole new journey for the country government and for an array of actors and final users for taxonomy. And as we are thinking about the taxonomy development, which is a huge process because we bring together an array of actors from so many sectors with so many perspectives, I really empathize with countries that it takes a lot of time. But at the same time, in parallel, we need to help country governments to think about the creation of tools that can help, one, to the socialization of the taxonomy. What is a taxonomy? What are the main elements? What are the sectors that are covered? What's the main use of a taxonomy? Socialization tools, we call it. We see infographics out there. We see webinars. We see certain online courses, self-paced courses as well. And also just to start opening the conversation around the definition of a taxonomy, the usage, the main objectives, and then also tools for the usage of the taxonomy, which enhance the user's experience, right? We see taxonomies that are over 300 PDF documents published out there. And then you get to see the user saying, but what do I do with this, right? So how do we translate this? We have CCAP, we have helped the Ministry of Finance in Chile to create guidance for users, a tool to actually just go to the economic activity that they are interested in, right? We also have created frequently asked questions that we receive through a round of webinars for implementation. We created webinars for implementation for each sector, divided by sector, and then divided by user. Financial institutions with financial institutions, enterprises with enterprises, big corporations, small, medium enterprises, and also users from the public sector, which we believe there's a huge potential for the usage of taxonomies under the public sector. And there's another type of tools that are the implementation tools. And those implementation tools is like, how do we embed these taxonomies in the more holistic public policy side, right? Like Daniel mentioned regulatory frameworks, but we can also think about how the public sector is using these taxonomies for perhaps climate budget tagging, monetary reporting and verification of climate finance, domestic, international, private sector, public sector. They can also be used, or also public procurement or the usage of taxonomies under state-owned enterprises. So I believe that these three type of tools that we have, yes, we have just defined socialization, usage, and implementation. There's something that we need to start thinking as we are working on the development of taxonomies, and also listening what is working and what is not. Daniel presented some amazing figures in terms of like what is lacking and how we can converge that. You mentioned, Daniel, something related to lack of bankable projects. And when I go and sit down with the project developers, they tell me, well, it's actually a lack of finance. So how do we find a middle ground in there? And a lot of tools as well are on the back office of financial institutions and banks, and that's private information that they don't want to disclose if they don't have a regulation. So also regulatory frameworks are super helpful in order to signal the market and start shifting around the capital that we require.
Okay, thank you. Fernanda, from the researcher perspective, what is your key bottleneck you see?
Yeah, I think one key bottleneck we identified in our research is definitely that the scope of taxonomies is sometimes too limited. I think, Daniel, you also mentioned that like some green projects are lacking. And I think this is precisely the idea of transition activities, that we also need to include activities that as of now are not green, but have the potential to be decarbonized and can be decarbonized in the foreseeable future. And I think this would also extend then the scope of taxonomies. But then again, I think one important note must also be that those frameworks should not be used as transition washing, essentially. So it must be clear what is the pathway for those activities included. Is it linked to science-based targets and pathways? And are there sunset dates? Are there phase-out dates? So that we don't risk investing in stranded assets. So I think it must be also from the perspective of an investor clear whether I can trust those thresholds in the data? Are they still up to date in 5 or 6 years? And what is also the institutionalized structure to ensure that those thresholds are regularly updated? For example, I mentioned this TSC review body within the Asian framework. I think this is an interesting example to also give investors trust that we can actually rely on those frameworks and that they are not just like a voluntary guidance document out there, but that there's actually robust data and work behind it.
Okay, thank you. Good points. Daniel, from your perspective, working on the ground in African countries, but also in Asian countries, and being, really in charge of developing a taxonomy, what is your take on this question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Katrin. We've heard, I think, a lot of different perspectives on this from different sides, and what I find very interesting when I also talk to people on the ground is what the biggest bottlenecks or challenges are. They, of course, we very often hear it's too complicated to use the taxonomy. We do not understand how to identify certain criteria or verify it. And that makes me sometimes think in my work, maybe it would be easier to develop really gradually these taxonomies, coming rather first from a white list and then going into more technical screening criteria approaches, because in the end, I always find we want to have an impact with these kind of frameworks, and we want to make sure that they're being used. And of course, we need to make sure that these frameworks are not being used in order to do greenwashing, which is, of course, a very big problem if we keep it broad. But from really from markets where there's less maturity in the financial sector, we've really heard a lot. It's rather good for us that we keep it a little bit broader in the beginning, have more whitelist approaches, so that we can test out the taxonomy, build out our internal systems, build the surrounding environment around it that we need in order then to move to more stringent, more technical screening criteria based approaches, so that you really make sure that you actually have the data and that everybody is being on board with the whole transition. So I feel it's very interesting. We can really look at this whole development from different sides, and it's a very good case also to say we need to have these very well developed frameworks so that we make sure that there's no greenwashing, that we channel money in those activities or that projects that really need the money in order, or the capital in order to move forward with the green transition. On the other hand, from the user perspective, I think it can really be more practical for them, and that we make sure that everybody who would like to be part of the transition can actually be part of it, especially SMEs, I think, which in the end is the majority, of course, in most countries, that there's a very big SME base who would like to be part of the transition as well, and therefore should also have the chance to be included in it.
Okay. I think that brings us back to the global map somehow, because of course it's more on the macro level, but for policymakers and market participants, how could this tool help navigate taxonomy design, but also implementation? Adja, you already mentioned the implementation tools that you identified across the world, but how would an open source tool be helpful in this way?
Well, what we aimed when doing this dashboard was because there was a lot of misinformation out there, right? It's like, oh, taxonomies are regulations. In some countries were like, oh my God, I'm not ready for a regulation. Or taxonomies are just going to enhance like plethora of green bonds, and that's not the main usage. Like Daniel just mentioned, like there's a wide variety of things to do with this. So what we're aiming with this dashboard practically is to socialize the term of taxonomies, and that really the users can get to see what are the commonalities, what are the environmental objectives, economic sectors, but also thinking that they're not alone, right? It's like there are many developing and developed countries working on this. We do really need interoperability, as Daniel mentioned. As I have explored these frameworks, I see that there's interoperability. I see that they are following kind of like similar frameworks, similar methodologies. And the main bottleneck, as I mentioned, it's how we implement this, right? And if we just have a handful of mandatory taxonomies, how will that look like for companies or financial institutions who work across the globe, right? It's like, how am I going to report to a country where it's mandatory, but in another country it's not, right? And the level of effort as well. So that's super important. And also we just want to spark the conversation. We want other institutions to use this information. And as us sitting down here, right, it's like we are talking about this, and then our aim is for other institutions and other actors and organizations to take on this research and continue exploring, go deeper into something that they feel interested with. So yes, that's the main aim of the dashboard, but also creating that sense of community around taxonomies for implementation, and that this is something real that we have been working for so many years, and there's a bigger goal in this. And let's not forget about the bigger goal, which is shifting capital to green investment, and not only mitigation, also adaptation, as Leonard mentioned, right? And other SDGs such as social just transition as well, biodiversity. We're seeing gender as well in Mexico. We're seeing social objectives in Brazil. We're seeing biodiversity objectives in Colombia, in Mexico as well. So moving forward the agenda, and perhaps with the taxonomy, we can align different sustainable development agendas, because sometimes it feels fragmented, biodiversity on this side, and then just transition on the other side, and then circular economy. So perhaps just combining all of our narrative, and then we can just signal the market in just one way.
Fernanda, do you also see some convergence emerging around good practices when it comes to transitional activities? You pointed out some examples, but I think there might be some other countries that address that as well.
Yeah, fully. And I also wanted to support the point that Adri just made. I think if you really look into the details of the frameworks, you see huge convergence. And I think, Katrin, we also did like this earlier comparison of quantitative thresholds for a specific sector. And these emission intensity thresholds, for example, they are often across the board the same. I mean, they might deviate when it comes to the equality or inequality sign, but they are often, it's the same number. And when we now, for example, look at the transitional activities, then one can really see that, for example, I mean, it's not only Singapore and Asian, but other frameworks have started to include the idea of transition plans, for example, also Taiwan and Thailand. There we also see convergence. I think if then a framework is essentially making transition plans obligatory for member activities, then, of course, the question is still, how does such a transition plan look like? As of now, I think the frameworks are usually not so detailed about that. And I think it's an important question also to avoid green or transition washing. So we need to make sure, what does it actually mean if a transition plan is 1.5 degree aligned? How does the pathway look like? What does that entail per country in terms of phase out and sunset dates? And there I also want to go back to Daniel's point that I think Leonard also made the point earlier. I think there we definitely need to leave some room for flexibility to consider the country's specific pathway. I mean, there's also effort sharing, and effort sharing in each country does mean something else also in terms of climate neutrality targets. So I think there's convergence, but I think we also need to acknowledge that there need to be a minimum room for flexibility to also acknowledge that we have in different countries different realities, and also different commitments that are also on the global landscape when we think about the UNFCCC negotiations accepted, right, and acknowledged. So I think those frameworks also need to take into account those realities.
Thank you. I would just bring up a question that was raised in the chat, which I found pretty interesting. So it's to all of the panelists, whoever would like to answer. So given the importance of taxonomies for climate financial flows, what are the implications of the US as a major player in global business and politics not having one? Who would like to share his or her thoughts on that? With the US not having a taxonomy so far, is that something that is challenging, is not important at the moment? Do we need the US to have a taxonomy in place?
I think I'll go because I represent an American think tank,
Happy to.
which is based in Washington, D.C. And as an NGO who has been out there for 40 years, right, we see a lot of different political shifts in terms of like climate change, climate finance, and actually there's no doubt, right, that this past year in the US federal administration has been pretty challenging for the international climate community and having the United States dropping out of the UNFCCC agreement. So what I see is that I believe in non-state actors, that they are moving forward regardless what the US and the federal administration can talk about climate change. So there are many non-state actors who operate across the globe, and they are already using taxonomies, either taxonomies from the EU or taxonomies in ASEAN or taxonomies in Latin America, in Africa. So perhaps we're not seeing coming in from a jurisdiction from the country government, but definitely non-state actors know what a taxonomy is, or starting to use it, and financial institutions who work across the globe, who work in North America, Canada, Mexico, they're definitely using a taxonomy in order to start thinking about their capital expenditure, their CapEx, and operational expenditures. That's where I'm seeing they are evaluating most in terms of how much green their operations and their economic activities are. So I do believe that taxonomies are huge in terms of signaling the market, but also let's take into consideration what non-state actors are doing in the United States, right? NGOs, private sector, financial institutions, they are part of international also commitments, and they are moving the agenda forward.
Okay, thank you. So I would just briefly do a round on one question on interoperability and then hand over to Jimena for the roundup. So to what extent, so how could a potential super taxonomy, which was discussed at the last COP, help address the current challenges around fragmentation, interoperability, and comparability across taxonomies? Daniel, what do you think? Is this what we need right now, the super taxonomy?
I think it's a very interesting approach, having a super taxonomy. Of course, it would help with certain fragmentation or lack of understanding in that sense, different definitions that we're using for a lot of the sectors, the activities that are included. Of course, from my opinion, I always see the taxonomy needs to be grounded in the local context so that it actually works. So this is a little bit the question then, how can a global taxonomy or super taxonomy kind of address this very specifically? So maybe for some sectors where it's really about climate change mitigation, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, where this could really work in that sense, because this is a global phenomenon. Obviously, we have global metrics that use it, but when it comes to other topics such as biodiversity, it is a very localized kind of impact and concept, which needs to really, in taxonomies, really needs to be showcased that it's depending on the local conditions. And I think here a super taxonomy would not facilitate the needed transition or impact that it has. But I think it's a very good thing to explore and see what comes up. I think if really like one of the leading initiatives also takes this over, I think it could be a very interesting initiative to discuss. But the practical implementation, of course, is to be seen.
Okay, thank you. Fernanda, quick thought on this as well?
Yeah, I think maybe if we do it on the level of elements that need to be in there, not really about the content and about the specific, like that we evaluate the alignment of specific thresholds with, I don't know, the Paris Agreement, I think then it could be helpful. And then it would be also possible that we say, okay, if these criteria are fulfilled, for example, we have the science-based origin of thresholds, we have a dynamic update of thresholds and dynamic criteria, then it's more on the level of structure rather than on the content level. Then I think it could work and maybe ensure that there's like a minimum level of quality fulfilled. But then again, I would support the point that Daniel made, that it needs to reflect the local and national realities of countries. Otherwise, I think it's not going to fly.
Okay, thank you. I think we are nearly at the end of the webinar, so I'll hand over back to you, Jimena, to wrap up, and thank you all for your questions in the chat and thoughts that you shared. Jimena.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you to every one of our panelists for the substantive and thought-provoking exchange. Before we close, I just want to briefly maybe synthesize what I heard today as the key takeaways from today's session. From Adriana's presentation, I take away that we've reached a turning point. Taxonomy design is no longer the central challenge. Countries are converging around similar frameworks and methodologies, but for taxonomies to actually shift capital at scale, they need to move beyond the standalone frameworks and become embedded in policy and regulatory instruments. From Fernanda's team's research, the picture is also clear. Taxonomies are spreading fast, but most still focus primarily on financing green activities, and the critical gap is in screening approaches, technical criteria for transitional sectors, particularly high-emitting ones, which are often absent or vague or lack a science-based pathway to net zero. From Daniel's perspective, we saw as a practitioner, the framing is also sharp. The question is no longer whether sustainable finance taxonomies will shape banking, because they already are. The question is how we effectively can help banks operationalize them. And to make this happen, Daniel points to 3 critical success factors: data availability, strong institutional coordination, and green investment pipelines. Taken together, I would say that today's conversation makes one thing clear. The question is no longer whether taxonomies are the right tool, it is how to make them work. That means better design, stronger regulatory integration, real support for practitioners, and a serious commitment to transition finance, not just green finance. I just want to thank each one of our speakers today and every one of the people that joined us for this amazing webinar. We will be sharing the recording, the materials, and we are also finalizing a policy report that will be a companion of this webinar, named From Design to Implementation, the Way Forward for Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, which elaborates on many of the themes we focused today. So we will share that once that's ready. Thank you so much for joining. We hope the session has been valuable, and we look forward to continuing this work and these conversations together. This concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great day.